Following the turmoil surrounding the election bribery and trial for the 62 BC year, we are told that Marcus Licinius Crassus paid the consul, Cicero, a visit. Crassus informed Cicero he had heard of a plot to overthrow the government, masterminded by Lucius Sergius Catilina, and that he, himself, was packing up his family and leaving Rome. The plot outlined the involvement of several Italian cities, as well as a significant number of veterans from Sulla's wars, who now, owning land in Etruria, were anticipating the cancellation of their debts. It was also rumored that Catilina had gained the support of Rome's young men who were not old enough to run for public office, and who, because of their age, could always be relied upon to think themselves more clever than the older generation, making them easy to manipulate into seditious behavior. This was troubling news for Cicero. Catilina had attempted runs at the consulship, twice for the 65 BC year, again for the 63 BC year, and finally for the 62 BC year. The amount of largesse he would have needed to spread in order to foment popular support that many times meant he had most likely borrowed heavily against the proconsular governorship he foresaw himself acquiring, which would have allowed him to make back his money and pay back his creditors. But he had failed to secure a consulship on each attempt, and was now bankrupt. Around this same time, Cicero received reports of a small army gathering to the north of Rome, and drew the conclusion that Catilina was casting one last throw of the dice on the gamble that, at the head of an army, popular support could be his for the taking. Cicero presented his evidence to the Senate, but the Senate was not immediately ready to condemn Catilina on reports of hearsay, even from Marcus Licinius Crassus, who had proven not above shady dealings. It took some time, and a great deal of debates, but Cicero finally convinced the Senate that Catilina posed a genuine threat to the Republic. At Cicero's urging, the Senate invoked the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, and Lucius Sergius Catilina was immediately put under house arrest. However, through Fulvia, the same woman who had warned Cicero of a conspiracy to assassinate the consuls on election day, Cicero learned that Catilina had escaped his house arrest, and fled the city to attend a secret meeting where, once again, a plot was hatched to immediately assassinate Cicero. Upon learning this news, Cicero put his home on lockdown. His gang of bodyguards became house guards, and let no one into the home who did not know the password. Cicero's villa, which had once belonged to the tribune, Marcus Livius Drusus, and which had specifically been designed for easy access by the public, was quickly transformed into a small military encampment, which succeeded in deterring the assassination attempt. At the next meeting of the Senate, Cicero put forth a bill to banish Catilina. As consul, under the terms of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, Cicero was empowered to do whatever he deemed necessary in preservation of the Republic. He was not obligated to seek the Senate's opinion on anything, but, after defending Gaius Rabirius over a 37-year-old death, hidden in the shadow of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, Cicero wanted the Senate's approval for whatever actions he took. If someone accused Cicero of something in 37 years, he meant to have the Senate's support through their own culpability. Unfortunately, few senators wanted to be on record against Catilina, so Cicero changed tactics. Instead of banishing Catilina, he called for the exile of a different senator, who was not at all involved in the Catilina affair. When the Senate jumped to the innocent man's defense, Cicero used their lack of defense for Catilina as an admission that they knew Catilina had, in fact, done something wrong. Having already fled the city, and meeting up with the army that had been growing north of Rome, Lucius Sergius Catilina declared himself the head of the new government in waiting. For the first time since the rebellion of Marcus Aemilius Lepidus in 77 BC, Rome was on the precipice of civil war. Inside the city of Rome, Catilina's allies approached a diplomat from one of the Gallic tribes, in order to try and persuade him, and his tribe, to join them in the overthrow of the government. This Gallic diplomat went straight to Cicero with the information he had learned. Cicero encouraged the diplomat to play along with the conspirators, while keeping him informed. Cicero now had a man on the inside of the conspiracy, which would allow him to better plan the takedown of Catilina's revolution. Per Cicero's instructions, the Gallic diplomat arranged a secret meeting with the conspirators still in the city, in order to coordinate their attack on Rome. When the conspirators arrived at the home of the diplomat, they found Cicero there with his bodyguards. Everyone was arrested. Cicero next went before the Senate and called for the death of the conspirators. He argued that there was no way of knowing the depth of Catilina's treachery, nor how many people throughout the city were involved in the plot. To put the conspirators to death would send a clear message to both Catilina, outside the city, and to any within the city who supported him, that the Senate meant business. Again, per the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, Cicero was empowered to put the men to death without senatorial approval, but he wanted the Senate on record right alongside himself. Both of the consuls elect for the 62 BC year agreed, and voted for the death penalty for Catilina's conspirators. The ex-consuls agreed, as did the praetors and praetors elect, until the debate reached Caesar. Standing, Caesar argued that the execution of any Roman citizen without trial was an act of authoritarianism, which would set a dangerous precedent for the future. Caesar argued, instead, for life imprisonment. Caesar's argument only made Cicero more suspicious as to his involvement with the whole Catilina affair. But Caesar's appeal against authoritarianism was well received by the Senate, and the majority began to change their votes to match Caesar's. Following speeches delivered by all of the other praetors, ex-praetors, aediles and ex-aediles, the speaking order finally came to the ex-quaestors. Marcus Porcius Cato, at just 32 years old, had already cultivated the reputation of being an arch-republican. Taking to his feet, Cato urged the Senate to pragmatism, chastising them for risking the republic for the sake of the faint-hearted. Cato argued that completely eliminating the threat, in preservation of Rome's republic, was the only possible solution, and warned the Senate that, should it wake up tomorrow to find the city in flames, they could blame no one but themselves. Once again, the Senate's mood shifted, and votes began switching back to the death penalty, until the majority was in favor of executing the conspirators. We are told that Caesar, once the vote was passed, went into a frenzy. Screaming in rage, he launched himself at the opposition. As Caesar's supporters attempted to hold him back, the rest of the Senate jumped to their feet, and a huge fight broke out on the Senate floor. To put a stop to the madness, Cicero brought in his bodyguards, who immediately surrounded the brawling senators, then drew their swords. The fighting instantly stopped. Every senator stood frozen, as the realization of what just happened dawned on them. Cicero, using his authority as consul under the protections of the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, had secretly armed men inside Rome's sacred boundary, known as the Pomerium. To bring a sword across the Pomerium carried the death penalty, and now the Senate was completely surrounded by men who had been armed by the consul. Caesar, who had, only moments before, argued that Cicero was acting in an authoritarian manner, broke the tense standoff by storming out of the Senate House. Caesar refused to return so long as Cicero remained in office. Surrounded by a horde of senators, Cicero left the Senate House. Retrieving the conspirators from the homes in which they were held prisoner, he led them all to an old cistern, which could only be accessed through the roof. Cicero and the senators led the prisoners onto the roof and, one conspirator at a time, tied nooses around their necks, and forced them to jump. For his actions during the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the Senate declared Marcus Tullius Cicero the father of the Republic. By this point, Cicero's consular term was nearly over. However, for the last days of his 63 BC consulship, every time Cicero appeared in public, a crowd would gather and applaud him. In his writings, Cicero would refer to this as the proudest period of his life. The Catilina conspiracy, although sharply dividing the city of Rome, completely unified the conservative party. With Catilina still in the company of his army outside the city, and groups of his supporters hanging around the Senate House in order to harangue and harass conservative senators with the threat of riots, Marcus Porcius Cato announced his candidacy to run as tribune of the plebs. This was a shocking announcement. Arch-conservatives did not normally run for this office, which was generally dominated by populists and reformers. But the optimates had rallied and, with the city still on the brink of violence, the people of Rome waited to see what the unified conservatives would do next. Cato, most likely with behind-the-scenes help from the conservatives, won election to one of the 10 seats. Because new tribunes of the plebs took office in December, Cato's first month as tribune coincided with Cicero's last month as consul. The first thing Cato did was introduce legislation related to the grain dole. For 6 decades, since the tribunate of Gaius Gracchus, the grain dole had been one of the foundational legislative cornerstones of the populares. For those same 6 decades, the optimates had consistently attempted to chip away at that cornerstone, trying to reduce its financial strain on the state. And yet, Marcus Porcius Cato, the ultra-conservative, immediately put forward a bill which would instantly quadruple the size of the grain dole. Although Cicero opposed the bill on the grounds of its extremely high cost, most of the conservative Senate quickly saw the brilliance of Cato's legislation. By stealing one of the biggest legislative weapons of the reformists, Cato hoped to associate the popularity of reforms, like the grain dole, with the optimates, and leave the populares with the negative image of violent revolution and invading armies. The people, who stood to immediately benefit from Cato's legislation, were thrilled, and Cato's bill passed into law before the end of Cicero's consulship. After learning of the death of the conspirators inside the city, and probably, in some measure, as a result of Cato's quadrupling of the grain dole, the rebel army that had assembled under Catiline fell apart. Most of the men deserted and, deciding that in the extra grain they had, at least, gained something, returned to their homes lest they find themselves executed as well. Left with only 3,000 men, Lucius Sergius Catilina's army was pursued back and forth between Rome and Gaul for a time, until finally they were massacred by the army of Catilina's one-time ally, Antonius Hybrida. Catilina died on the battlefield. His body was found well ahead of the rest of his men, indicating that he had led the charge on foot, and all his men died of frontal wounds.